Good afternoon, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. My name is Nicole Cole, and I'm a Senior Specialist of School Quality and Accountability with the DC Public Charter School Board. And DC PCSB has been hosting a series of webinars throughout the extended school closures in response to COVID-19. We want to make sure that we are providing supports to teachers and leaders within our sector as we continue to not only do distance learning, but start to plan for the re-entry. Today's session will be led by Alicia Robinson of EdPlus Consulting, and it is titled Preparing for Back to School, Teacher and Leader Orientation. Alicia will introduce all of the panelists. We have representatives from LEA is here to talk specifically what they're doing around this topic. Throughout the presentation, if you have anything that you would like to ask, you can put it in the chat, or you can also utilize the Q&A feature. Please be sure that anytime you chat a response that you select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your response and it can lead to a really full discussion. The webinar will be recorded today, and all of the materials will also be provided to you in our distance learning library that is on the PCSB website. That's also where you can find all of our past webinars and materials from past sessions. So with that, I will turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you, Nicole. It's great to be here today and to be with all of you. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm excited to introduce this very esteemed panel of folks working here in DC in education. And in other parts of the country too. So as Nicole said, again, I'm Alicia Robinson. I do work here in DC and across the country kind of at the intersection of talent and equity, and work in schools and other social sector organizations. And I'm excited to have Dalia Aguilar with us, who has spent, I think, most of her career here in DC working on issues of education equity, currently serving as the Chief Schools Officer at Mundo Verde, where she was the founding principal. And I think your son went there also, right? But is now a student at DCI. So Dalia has worked in DC public schools for most of her career, and both charter and district schools, and has a passion and just a lot of great respect in the world of multicultural and multilingual education in particular. So thank you for being with us today, Dalia. Natalie Gordon is our second person that is joining us on our panel today. She is currently the Chief Schools Officer for Attuned Education Partners. Attuned partners with school systems to prioritize, tailor, and implement a diverse set of instructional practices. And Natalie also has spent almost all of her professional career, all of it in education, but almost all of it here in DC. And in this role she's had at Attuned for a while now, she is now branching out to do work even more across the country again. She has been, I think, directly before the role she's currently in, she was the instructional superintendent in DC Public Schools supervising middle schools. And she, her bio doesn't say this, but I think that it's accurate to say that she is a award-winning school leader, having served as a principal in charter and district schools, and at the senior level in central office too, as well as work with DC Teaching Fellows, which is where I think I first met Natalie many, many moons ago, and working at, as I said, a few charters and DCPS. And last but not least, Kenneth McCants-Pearsall is currently the Chief Academic Officer for Two Rivers. He's been in that role since 2019, and I'm sure it's been a really long year in lots of ways, being in that role. And he, in his role as CAO, he oversees all aspects of the instructional program for the two elementary campuses and middle school that are part of the Two Rivers community. Kenneth has worked for Teach for America, most recently before being CAO at Two Rivers, as the managing director program in the greater Philadelphia area. And he has a lot of expertise and experience doing instructional support and development for teachers and coaches, having served as principal, supervisor, principal, and assistant principal. So again, I think I'm so excited to have these three people with us today, and I think what's most important, well, part of the reason I wanted to have all of them join is that their kind of center in their work is around education equity and making sure that all of our students, particularly the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, are being served through the work that they do. And with that, I want to first spend a little time, as I always say to people, if you know me, you know a little bit about the fact that I care a lot about equity for students, particularly Black and Brown students, as we think about the work that is happening here in DC. And so again, for those of you who might have joined us last week, we have Dr. Lydia Carlos joining us today, who is just another amazing educator. So I'm hoping she joins in this conversation also today, because she has had a lot of great experience now currently working on her own, doing education consulting work in areas of research and special education and early childhood education in general, but also in her free time professionally, if there is such a thing, she does a lot of great photography work too. So she is someone to know for sure. And Dr. Carlos really grounds all of her work in equity too. So with that, and I see Kenneth saying too, well, yeah, we need those headshots. If you haven't gotten your headshots, I think she's figuring out distance ways to make that happen soon. All within CDC compliance. So with that though, I'm gonna turn it over to Lydia to explain to us and ground us in an equitizer, which is something she's developed as part of her work with her own business, I Imagine Ed. And so Dr. Carlos, I'll turn it over to you to explain it more and tell us what our equitizer is for today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with these amazing educators. We're going to spend about 15 minutes doing an equitizer, and an equitizer is just a way to begin an important and sometimes controversial discussion focused on what's really important, which is ensuring equity, diversity, inclusion is at the core of the conversation and at the core of the goals for what comes out of that conversation. So I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to read this silently. If you are joining us as a participant, I would love to see your thoughts and comments about the questions that we're asking in the chat. Please make sure that you do share with all panelists and attendees so that we can lift up your voices through our own, since we won't get a chance to listen to everyone, but that's also a way to ensure equity and inclusion, is that we're reading your comments as we go, and we will take some time to shout you out. So I'm gonna be quiet for a few minutes so that you all can read, and then I'll ask the panelists if they will respond to the questions. So we'll have about 1 more minute to read and think. And I would love to see your comments and questions for the panelists in the chat. So panelists, I'm gonna ask you to share your thoughts, and we're already getting some really great feedback in the comments, which I'll be reading and listening at the same time. Kenneth, since you're closest to me on the screen, why don't you start?
Sure. So in terms of what we were looking for before all of this happened, we're like three things that we look for in like every staff member, right? So it's alignment to our mission and a strong belief in that. People who are learners and people who are collaborators. And I think all of those things, none of that has changed in this period. I think it just has required us to be even more focused on being learners, because for some of us, this doing everything virtually is a totally new experience. And even for those of us who are like well-versed in being virtual, doing that with kids is still a new experience. So people who are willing to learn. We also have people who are really great at this and people who are struggling. And so how are we building that collaborative nature? And even and the opportunity that it presents is like, it's not just within our building now. Like we can have teachers collaborating across buildings easily because of the technology. And so I don't think it's really changed. I think it's really forced us to double down on those things that we believe in. And even now that we're in the midst of looking for new talent for next year, really diving in on like people's ability to be adaptive and flexible in connecting. I think in terms of what has been hard in terms of learning while leading, is just not having the answers, right? Like we have not experienced this in our lifetime. And so like even trying to think about all the possible scenarios for the fall is overwhelming as someone who is responsible for like all of our schools. And then having other leaders looking to you for the answers and having to say, I don't know is not only, I'm sure, frustrating for them, but it is terribly frustrating for me because I want to have the answers. And I think the last piece in terms of like the culture of like, the other thing that is learned, being, thinking through is just like this culture of experimentation that we saw there, and like wanting to have the most innovative things happening to figure out what works and what's not working in this remote setting, because this is probably not the last time we're going to have to implement distance learning in the next couple of years. But also, how do we do that in a way that is equitable, where our folks who are really great at this, the students of those teachers are not getting more and better, while we also have teachers who are struggling to implement. And so trying to find that balance. So those are the things I've kind of been thinking through and struggling with.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'm gonna go to Natalie and ask if you have anything to add or anything different that you've been thinking through around what you're looking for now, if different. And I know you're in a different position, but yeah.
Yeah, I just want to agree with a couple of things Kenneth is saying. One, and the partners that I work with, the really maintaining the values that you have as a school and keeping those values at the center of your hiring practices, I think are key. And the challenge is, how do you do the work of finding the right people in this virtual like new setting? And I think pushing your hiring practices to really dig deeper into getting to know candidates individually when you can't touch people and see people, it's so challenging, and you don't want to lose sight of your values because you're sticking to like an outdated practice. Yeah, like I just want to co-sign on Kenneth's, doubling down on what are the values of this organization and continuing to bring in people who are aligned to those values. The other thing that's been on my mind about this question is this idea of experimentation. One of the things that worries me individually is that we do so much experimenting and innovating that we lose sight of the fact that kids need to be learning. And we have lots of schools that around the country that are doing good work around in a virtual setting. And how are we really taking this time to take a few minutes to stop and learn from them so that we don't get into the space of developing new ideas and allowing so many freedoms that don't lead to children really learning in this new and really challenging space.
Thank you, Natalie. And Dahlia?
I won't be redundant. So much of that really resonated with me in terms of focusing on vision and mission of the school. Doubling down definitely resonated with me. And I think I would just add to it, really seizing this as an opportunity to deepen in the areas where it's who you always should have been in the matter of school, and really using this as an opportunity to get there. I think as we're looking at candidates, we are still looking for what we ever look for in terms of alignment with our mission. But more specifically, as I'm watching candidates and looking at videos, I'm also asking myself, what do I see in them about this adaptive piece around mental health and wellness that's going to be a contribution or an area of growth? And that is a little bit different. I think you always start off the school year with a focus on students and relationship building and making sure they have the tools to manage their school year. But now you have students maybe coming to you with challenges that didn't present in the same ways previously. And when we think about the data in our cities, students who may have been exposed to physical abuse or neglect, or perhaps exposed to domestic violence in the home, like these things that, while they may have been part of their landscape previously, now may have been intensified in the time that they were away from us. I think really designing for the students who have the greatest need and really thinking about school in a kind of flipped model, like how do we start with one and then build out for the group, when oftentimes schools think about the group and then build and differentiate for the one. And that's something that is really resonating with teacher leaders and teachers and instructional leaders at Mundo Verde.
Thank you. In the comments, a couple of folks, Summer Ellis and Samantha Lopez, shared that experimentation can be scary, and that we know that everyone isn't happy. Like, people are fearful, they might be actually upset about all the change that is happening that they didn't anticipate. So yes, we can learn from what has happened virtually in the past, but that has not been happening in this context. So what are you all thinking around what specifically, so the mental health piece that Dahlia just shared, for instance, like what are the things that you all are thinking around how to be empathetic and have equity for your staff in this new situation that is not just about virtual learning, but it's about virtual learning in the midst of a pandemic when the teachers are and the leaders are dealing with the same thing as the children?
So let me just say I have a ton of empathy. I have a 4th and a 5th grader at home who also go to our school, and I'm an educator, and it is still hard to like balance all of these things. And so I think starting there, and when we knew that we were going to be moving into this distance learning piece, the first thing was like, how do we make this sustainable for folks? Because not only are our teachers like teaching, but they're also caregivers of kids, of parents, of whomever, and we have to be responsible for that. And so we decided, like, there's no way that you can work an 8-hour day, right? Like, kids aren't going to be teaching learning 8 hours. You can't be teaching 8 hours a day because of life. And so thinking about like, what are the things, like, it forced us to really go back to not only our mission, but like, what are the things that we want to be true for kids during this time? And how do we do that in a way that is sustainable for staff? And, you know, it was helpful for me from my manager, and I try to do that with the folks that I support in terms of like, how are you just blocking out time during your day where you're just taking care of yourself, right? Like this is also an opportunity where like most of us would not be able to say from 11 to 1, I'm going to do like nothing. I'm going to go for a walk or do this or do that. And so like, how are we building in self-care in our days so that we can be the best we're on? Because it is also very tiresome looking at a screen all day, right? And so you have to do those things, and you have to go to the grocery store and all of that. So really just understanding where our people are and being able to check in with them. I think the other challenge that this presents is like, we don't have those hallway moments where we just bump into folks anymore and like, oh, how are things going? Or let me pick your brain or all of that. So how are we building and being intentional about building in those, like maybe we're texting more, or maybe we're jumping on FaceTime just to say, hey. So thinking about those ways where we're still building connection for folks and also allowing them space in their schedules to take care of themselves. And it was interesting that we had a parent reach out about like this, we're not teaching enough and all of that. And we had to run them like, oh, like our teachers are caregivers and parents too. And they totally like apologized because they were like, I totally forget that, right? Like when you're thinking about like what's happening with my kid, you forget that the person on the other end is also human and has like responsibility and obligations and families as well. So just helping people find that balance and care for themselves has been a priority too.
Thank you. Circle, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Miss Lomax said something similar, that leading right now is challenging because you can't just pop into a classroom or have a quick check-in in the same way as you could before. So I think as you all are moving into the larger discussion, I hope that you'll be thinking about ways that you can support teachers in the new space that you're in with whatever you're training them on this summer, because training is one thing, but we know that implementation is where it's at. So how are you thinking about building in the supports for them to implement well in a way that they haven't had to think about in the past at most schools? So thank you for your time. I'm going to read the rest of the comments, and if I can respond, I will. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, for that. And I just want to reiterate too, feel free, we'd love this to be somewhat interactive, so feel free to continue to give us comments in the chat that we'll be looking at throughout the conversation, as well as to ask questions. We'll leave some time for questions near the end. So I think there were a few people with questions that came up here too that we'll try to make some time to talk about either through the conversation or at the end also. And I think I would just want to reiterate what Lydia said, that I think some others have said too through the chat, and our panelists too have kind of pointed out. We are not just distance learning, we're like learning through trying to get some learning done through a pandemic, right? So this is not just like, how did we shift to distance learning all of a sudden, but this is, there are real tangible issues that are going on for the people we're teaching, the teachers we're working with, and for the leaders even that are in this space too. So there's even more of a need to kind of step back and make sure we're checking on each other. And I always like to particularly ask school leaders, many of them have heard me say, how's your heart doing really at this time? But I think it's important that we ask our school leaders, our folks that are being asked the questions a lot of what are we going to do, tell us all the answers, that are trying to figure out the answers, how they're doing. So Dahlia, Natalie, Kenneth, how are you all doing?
I was, I think, early in this process when we first understood we were going to be doing distance learning. I was being me and getting a lot of compliments about like, wow, like you're really great in a crisis. And I was like, people, that's for real bad reasons, let me just say. Early trauma, So I think it is important to sort of to be thinking about your own wellness is to be thinking about the wellness of others. As a leadership team, we've tried very much to connect even more than previously in different ways. We also are hoping to take what we're learning about the lives of our teachers into the school year, because I think that this is where we learned who was taking care of their whole family. This is where we learned who, you know, had vulnerable, you know, family members as it related to this particular illness. This is where we got to see the, you know, the kids bouncing on each leg as, you know, leaders and teachers are trying to manage this work. And I think keeping that like at the forefront is going to be really important. How I'm doing is really trying to model a little bit of some of that wellness, trying to share with some members of our team ways and opportunities to be thinking of oneself, and even really as we're designing, like thinking about what do I need and how is that what probably everybody needs right now, and being really steadfast, I think, in what Kenneth was saying, which is that oftentimes stakeholders may pull you in different directions with their needs and their desires and their wants, and really maintaining a focus on if teachers are not well, then students are not well. So we have to really think about what's going to support them. We are looking, for example, even in the realm of evaluation, I kind of giggled a little when Lydia was saying, you know, we can't visit them, we can't step in their classes. We are doing that. We are looking at the videos they record. We're looking at some of their live sessions as well, but we're not doing it for the purpose of evaluation. We're really doing it for the purpose of like celebrating what teachers are doing and giving them feedback on like, we see you working hard, we see what's working. And more than anything, it's about informing like our future work. And so I think that makes me feel better when I'm caring for teachers and for students in that way and for families in that way. And yeah, I'm trying to just maintain some kind of balance in all of this. Also, managing a 6th grader who's about to be a 7th grader. And so I also see what it looks like sometimes when it's, even if it's optimal, it's not optimal. And so having that kind of grace also supports me spiritually.
Yeah, absolutely. Natalie or Kenneth, jump in. How are you doing?
Yeah, I was gonna start with, I'm just taking care of 2 cats, so I have a little bit less stress than the parents on the call. I think like the benefit, quite honestly, in that I don't have to also teach children and manage the virtual classroom for my own kids, and also do my job, is that it gives me the luxury of taking on work from my colleagues. And that is one way that I've made it a mission to do better for the world around me, right? And right now I can immediately do better for those in need. And those in need around me are people who are managing the 3 jobs of being partner, parent, and whatever is their role in an organization. So that is helping to keep me busy and helping to sustain me. The thing that I wanted to kind of riff off of in terms of what Dahlia was saying was this idea that as leaders, we have to have really intentional wellness practices, and that we need to bring those wellness practices to our teams. And you guys see me moving right now, it's because I'm standing. Everybody in my organization pretty much has a standing desk because we are now on Zoom meetings all day long. And I think about like how as an organization we adopted this practice, but there are things that all schools can do to do the same kind of work around helping to make this life of virtual learning less cumbersome, less tiresome. If it's shorter hours, then that's what it is. But there are also other intentional practices like intentionally starting your meetings with check-ins, just like you did today, Alicia. Intentionally making sure that you build into your PDs regular team building and culture building versus like the intention around instruction and data, et cetera. Like we got to make sure our people are good. If our people are not good, our kids are not going to be good. So being more thoughtful about how much time and space you allow for the wellness piece, and making sure that your team members know that it's okay to do that. We know that happy folks are the best and highest achieving people in organizations. And so the way that we can spread our love and happiness to the people that work with us are only going to make our work even greater for the kids.
Thank you for that. Good reminders. Kenneth,
Yeah.
tell us about you.
I'm tired, y'all. I'm tired.
Be honest,
and,
yeah.
I think some of the lessons that I'm learning for myself, right? Like the days are longer at home because like you're just on meetings all day, and with kids, like I feel like I'm trying to practice grace for myself, right? Like the days at home are much longer than they feel like at school, because you're not working in like a straight line from like 8 to 5. You take 2 hours here, and then you're working from like 9 to 11 to catch up on things. And so for me, it's being vulnerable and telling, and like my team, I'm like, I can't do any more meetings today. Like, can we reschedule this, or can we move it later? And we've been doing that with each other, right? And also saying like, does this meeting have to be a Zoom? Can we just go for a walk and talk on the phone about whatever it is? So just finding those ways to like balance everything out. I did make a note to myself to get a standing desk, so thank you, Natalie. So I can roll it around. But I think, yeah, ultimately this is I'm trying to see all of this as an opportunity, right? Like the one thing that I think is great is like, we are cooking at home more, and spending more time as a family together. And I'm learning more about my kids and their friends, and what they're learning and how they learn, being with them and doing the work with them. And it's just made my decision making as a leader more empathetic. Just being able to like understand like what it must be like, right? Both on the parent side, but also on the staff person side. So it's a struggle. I want to get out the house. I want to hang out with my friends. But I'm also trying to find all the opportunities here. And I will say that like, for some reason, like being home, like I've felt like I've connected more with my family virtually than we do like, and it wasn't that like Zoom just got invented, right? It's just like, I think we're all seeing it as like, oh, we could do this. Like, why haven't we been doing this? And so
we have the time to do this now.
Yeah, and so I'm seeing all the opportunity, and just feeling grateful for that, even while I want to get back to like as close to normal as possible, be back in school with kids and teens.
Sure. Thank you for sharing your feelings, your real authentic feelings, but also some tips too. And I'm sure Natalie didn't get into it a ton, but I'm sure she'll also be willing to give tips on using Peloton for anyone that wants that. I'm hoping she's keeping up with her Peloton schedule during this time. So thinking a bit about the adjustments, this is that time of year, many of you have already mentioned for sure that people are finishing out hiring for next school year, hopefully finishing it out. In an ideal world, it may look a little bit different this year than it has in past years, but also planning for the summer. I know a lot of schools planning for the summer in terms of what new teacher orientation, all staff orientation will look like and things like that when teachers come back. And I know a lot of schools that maybe even spend the week of spring break with some of the leaders thinking through that work, and that was a while ago. Unfortunately, this year, we don't have the luxury of doing all that planning with a lot of things in place that we're used to having in place, whether that's even like the school budget for next year that I know is still up in the air. And we're waiting to get some more word from the mayor on what that looks like here in DC, at least. But when you think about these adjustments that might need to be made, again, it has been stated, I think Kenneth brought it up initially, that in your roles, you're really looked to as the people to have all the answers. And that's particularly challenging to have every answer, given that there are so many things that are out of control, whether it's out of your control, whether it's when schools will be open, if they will open in the fall, or what requirements might be put in place for health care needs, such as having PPE and social distancing and things like that. How do you kind of go, knowing all of that, how do you kind of go about balancing both trying to start to plan ahead with not having all the answers? Natalie, why don't you start out first with the schools that you're working with? How is this coming up, and what are you helping them do, and what are you doing even in helping them balance?
Yeah, I mean, we're not, right? Like, it's this is a tough time, and there's new information coming out every day. So it's very difficult, I think, to balance the what we're going to do next and the immediate, because it's hard to stay on top of all the new information. What I think what's fortunate about the role that I play is I get to kind of dig into all the new stuff. Like I read every morning the latest updates from varying news organizations. I talk to partners and my colleagues to try to bring together the best resources I can for the school partners that I do work with. to make it easier for the principals and the school leaders of those organizations. They don't have to do all that navigating, and it therefore helps to make it a little bit easier to work on the immediate if you have someone helping you out with long term, right?
Sure.
But I don't quite honestly, I don't know that we have like a handle on it right now because we can't, right? What we can do is, saying earlier, like use our resources and talk to people and figure out what are the decisions that we can make right now. Like there are curriculum decisions we can make right now for the fall based on what we've done in the past, right? We know for a fact that there are going to be significant trauma issues with our kids and our staff members when they come back. So what can we do? Who can we assign to that bucket of work to start digging into what new SEL practices we're going to use in the fall to help mitigate the trauma that our communities are going to bring with them to school. And then I think like big picture, we are working on some strategic planning that includes longer term objectives. And if we can create some really, really good plans with schools now, there are a couple of schools in DC who I'm working with to help make that happen. You know, if we can make sure that people have good plans to help them get kicked off with the work when things slow down, which will hopefully be in about 3 weeks, then I think it'll sort of alleviate this anxiety that folks are feeling. Because, you know, at least knowing that you have a plan and a direction is better than not knowing at all. Yeah.
How about you, Dahlia? What would you add?
Yeah, I think I think it's also about anticipating the things that you do know, the social emotional, you know, wellness that, you know, Natalie was just describing. But I think it's also about knowing yourself. Like, what are your gifts as an organization? What are your gifts as leaders and teacher leaders? And really leveraging the best of you, like for this particular moment in time. So, for example, Mundo Verde is a school that's focused on sustainability. And I sent this picture to my executive director the other day that was a picture of, like, you know, early 1900 outdoor classrooms. And I was like, social distancing? And then, like, within a week, all of a sudden, there were articles like that I was seeing in different like groups that I'm in on Facebook, because I'm old, where people were talking about like, yes, like this is a way you can actually honor like the young child, like who they are intrinsically, what they need in terms of discovery, and still honor this new universe where you might not have your whole class or you only have a few students, and it's still aligned with our mission. And so I think we're also then at the classroom level saying, what are teachers doing right now that are just like knocking it out of the park, right? Like, what do they know about this that we don't know as leaders, that we never could have known about them as teachers? And how do you take those gifts and say, okay, well, we need to get, you know, Mr. So-and-so to like do a workshop this summer for other teachers so that he can share like how he's used this particular technology. Because even as there are some teachers who have been uncomfortable in this new sphere, and there are some people who are like just new, like they're new teachers. They really had a chance to just focus on their lessons and their practice, maybe not have to monitor as much the dynamics, right, of a whole class, and who they've been are real stars in this work now because they've really had the time to pause, focus on their practice. And so I think it's really about noticing where your gifts lie and thinking about how to align those to some of the more adaptive problems that lie ahead.
Yeah, I love that. Anything you'd add, Kenneth?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the only thing that we're thinking about on a technical piece is, right, like come August, how do we take all of what we're learning and all of what we normally do and adjust for, like, are we going to be in person? Are we going to have to do orientation virtually? So like thinking about like, how do we take those things and like create all these scenarios for what might be. But I would co-sign everything that Dahlia and Natalie said.
Yeah, and so as you've kind of started to bring this up a little bit, but it feels like in some ways you're both doubling down on skills that you knew you make great teachers in general, and there's also potentially some new things that are coming up. or that you're seeing, you know, particularly as we go into next year, even though we might start the fall in one way, we might have another situation mid-year and another situation by the end of the year. I mean, we all, I think, are assuming now that the 2020, 2021 school year will have lots of fluctuation and so forth. So when you think about that, and I see even a question someone asked, or a point someone posed too, about how this might change kind of role differentiation or teaching adaptability in action. Like, what are some of the skills and competencies that are really coming to mind for you about what teachers and other instructional staff, and even, you know, your front desk staff, like, you know, your operational staff and so forth, really need to have as they come in for this coming school year, as well as what things how that might impact what training you might provide in the summer to get them ready to do that? Kenneth, I think you came off mute.
I mean, yeah, I think the big one is like flexibility and adaptability, right? Like, we are currently running through all these different scenarios of like, who can come back and when can they come back and how long and this or that. And that is totally like, and at least right now, everybody's home, right? And so there's some predictability with like who we're engaging with, right? In the fall, that may be very different depending on the level and the amount of students and staff that can be in buildings. And so like, how do we build, and that's that adaptive challenge, right? Of like, how do we get people to see like the increasing need to be more flexible, and like being able to like respond to change, and that change management where change is happening like all the time versus like big points in the year where we know like, oh, somebody's leaving or this or that. Like, change is literally like going to be the constant for, you know, I would say probably like the next 6 to 12 months, if not longer. And so like, how do we build that muscle for folks and be able to like process quickly, adjust quickly, process quickly. So thinking about that. But I also think it's like, every year we go through this process of trying to, we create an instructional focus that helps us like narrow what we're like prioritizing for the year. And it is hard to prioritize. But I think this year, like, it is going to be critical that we say like, this is the one thing or the two things that we are doubling down on this year. And we're gonna have to be okay with letting something go. Because we don't even know how much time we will have with kids and in what capacity. And just also having people understand that like, yeah, we got to say no to a lot of things and double down on a lot fewer things.
Yeah, makes sense. I see, Natalie, you seem to be co-signing some.
I was about to co-sign in the chat on that last statement. Because, clearly, because I think this new skill that we're learning, which is effective distance learning strategies, right? That is going to be a lift for lots of folks. How we manage it is going to be a lift. How we ensure that children and families really engage in it is going to be a lift. How we schedule for it is going to be a lift. And that's going to consume quite a bit of what we thought we were going to do for teacher PDs and so forth. So absolutely, like 100%, Kenneth, how you're thinking about what are you going to drop off the plate of a long-term plan so that you can focus on really good access to educational opportunities for kids in light of what is our ever-changing educational landscape.
I think I would just add to that too, Alicia, like for us, part of the focus is going to have to be on, you know, you can argue about whether Maslow should be hierarchical, you know, in nature, but really like flipping that pyramid, right? And really saying to ourselves, okay, first, let's make sure that we understand like how everybody's feeling in terms of safety and resource, like being able to not just do the sort of traditional diagnostics that one does at the beginning of the year, right? To sort of see where students are, you know, compared to where they left off, but real heart work, right? Like, how are our kids? Like, what was their experience this summer?
Yeah.
Where are our teachers? What was their experience during the summer? And being able to then plan from that, plan for social emotional wellness that is really mindful of that being critical to anything else being able to happen, right? And, you know, Kenneth is also at an EL school. And as an EL school, I think one of the benefits was you already had structures for social emotional wellness, like crew on a daily basis. And so then those things really helped in the transition, because if you already had those strong relationships, that really served to be able to reel kids in for the academics, right? And understanding that those things are not divorced from each other at all. Like the ability to get a child to come to the class, to stick with you during the class, right? And to have different strategies, like the teachers who had that already, I think sailed in a little bit more easily than teachers who were still struggling with relationships and dynamics in their classroom. So I think it really is about flipping that, you know, flipping the priority is still learning, right? But how you're going to get there cannot ignore like all of the physiological, psychological, like emotional elements that we've all been experiencing during this time.
Yeah. And just to add on really quickly to what Delia's saying is that realistically, we're probably going to start in the fall in this virtual space, right? So even those those outstanding relationships that your teachers were able to build because they knew kids for 6 months prior to the break, there's going to be some need to address how you get back to those great relationships with kids who are new to your school, with kids who have had no touch points with your teachers, and what do your past systems look like in the new space? Even if we start a month late, that's a month that we have to figure out how to build relationships with kids in a virtual space.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up some really good points too. I think Empower K-12 I think earlier this week put out these possible recommendations. I mean, there's lots of places, of course, that are putting out their recommendations for what reopening school might look like, but they came up with these sort of 5 principles that they think should guide what thinking should be, and the flexibility, having schedule flexibility in flex time, possible like health restrictions, as we talked about, like social distancing as a priority and PPE. Yeah, honoring the idea of multimodal learning with online learning continuing to take place, whether we're actually physically in classrooms or working from home too. And then this idea of continuous improvement, that, as I said before, the year is going to continue to evolve and feel different. So how do we plan for that essentially? And then also figuring out how to just generally prevent further instructional loss by making sure that instructional time is quality already. So, whether it's, I think, Kenneth, you mentioned this earlier, maybe it's less learning, but it's actually quality instructional time and such, right? So when you think about that, and you're thinking about your considerations for summer PD and learning, how do you kind of take these? I mean, first of all, I guess I should ask, do you agree with these principles in general? And then secondly, how do you think you would go about implementing them, and how you're thinking about your professional development in, let's say, August-ish, as well as throughout the school year? Give you a second to process and jump in.
Yeah, I think largely agree with those principles. I think it's sort of it's what we have to do in this time. I think I want to be really thoughtful about further instructional loss, right? Like I'm getting really worried with this notion of behind, like our kids being behind, right? And so you could be behind grade level expectations, you could be behind other kids, you could be, behind what's required on state assessments. And I think it's just really important to calibrate so that we're not in this state of trying to make up for the impossible. Like there's loss, like there will be loss. And so figuring out, okay, how do you still maintain some accountability for what you're doing so that you know that students are learning and progressing, but let's not pretend, right? And I think a lot of what I hear sometimes and the planning about coming back to school is founded on premises that actually have nothing to do with the reality of children in our school right now or in the lives of teachers. I think, for example, about the push to get little ones back to school so that people can go to work, which we know is important and we know it's critical, but you want to talk about who's the least safe in an environment, and it would be little kids who've got their fingers in their mouths and noses all day, right? And who are like climbing all over each other like baby bears.
Yeah.
So like, really being able to ask ourselves, okay, what loss, sort of what cost, and what can we honestly like mitigate for, so that we're not stressing, you know, the system. And when I talk about system, I'm talking about people. Like we're not stressing the system with this imaginary, like we're there, right? There's no imaginary we've arrived. We're going to be figuring this out as we go along, and whatever we designed for in the last couple of months is probably not what we're going to design for in the fall. We designed this like on the fly, throwing one stone out and crossing the river. Like what we'll do in the fall, we'll have more time to think about. And even then it might be a miss because there's so many factors. So I just having that grace, I think. The last one is the one I think I worry the most about, right? Loss compared to what?
Yeah, really good point. It's important to unpack that. That's a whole other webinar we could do, right? Unpack that language we're throwing at some of this, but for sure, thanks for making that point. Natalie or Kenneth, anything you want to jump in with? And I think, Talia, you covered that so well. I think also thinking about, I think, Kenneth, you just brought up a point about middle school students too that might not have built relationships, even though your elementary school students are looping. I can't remember if all of them loop at the same time. So if this will be the second year of being with the same teacher, or if there's a way to make that possible in all cases. But how do you, even though you're trying to make all of that happen, you guys are really thinking a lot about how to do it and how to hear what other people are going through and what they're saying. How do you like make sure that there's kind of, I think Lydia brought it up earlier, the point of equity of voice. How do you make sure you're getting opinions from the people that are most impacted from it? Like how are you getting teacher opinions in there and balancing that with, the idea that they might be one person's opinion sometimes, and other times you have to, kind of think of the whole as opposed to the individual. How are you navigating that?
Yeah, so we have given, like, I feel like I should play a drinking game every time I hear survey, because we've given so many surveys. But I think part of that is like, not only have we given surveys, we've also like called our parents who are harder to reach, because we know that like we are a very socioeconomically diverse school. And so we know that like often the parents with more access are more likely to like complete the survey. And so like we wanted to make sure that we were hearing from a variety of families. So we literally just called families up and asked them the same questions and had conversations, which was really insightful. We also surveyed students about what they, want and need in this moment, and we will continue to do that. We also, on Monday at my leadership team meeting, we had students come and share like how they want to close out the year and showcase their learning. And so just continuing to make sure that we are hearing from every constituent, to make sure that we're capturing like a broad array of voices is really important to us. And then also thinking about like how people give input on the decisions as well, has always been really important to us as an organization.
Totally.
I want to talk about one of the gifts of this. Well, I've never thought I would say this about Zoom, but Zoom is a gift. One of the things that was really inspiring about this opportunity is we started to have our parent engagement through Zoom. And so you could phone in, right, or you could be on your computer. And what ended up happening there is sort of the elevation of voices that usually are silent, right? So you might have parents who are with their voice saying, this is what I need, this is what I want, or these are some of the challenges. And then you would have like maybe 30 comments that were in agreement or in disagreement, but like 30 voices that in your typical parent meeting, you might not have heard, right? Because they weren't able to chat what they were thinking. And so I think this is something where we're asking ourselves, like, how can we continue with some of these things, whether or not we have to social distance to really, engage more families. Another thing we're experimenting with, it's not this, it seems promising to us, but this platform called Possip, which sends out text messages. It's like 3 questions that families get asked, typically the same 2 questions, and then the third you get to sculpt as a school. And what that means is that families who might not literally be on computers, right, or only have access to their cell phone can really quickly give you feedback. And part of what Possip does is then groups it for you and says, lots of people are thinking this, a few people are thinking that, here's something to prioritize for the coming week, because things are moving so quickly. The sort of turnaround and the closing of communication loops, it's not like we don't ask for feedback, but sometimes it's hard for stakeholders to see what we did with that feedback, what became of it, right? And I think getting really much like that is going to be really important, especially when you're not seeing all your stakeholders all the time, you're not seeing all your students all the time or teachers all the time. Like this loop is going to be really important to get right.
Can you repeat the name of that survey platform?
It's funny. It's Possip. It's like positive gossip.
Oh.
Yeah.
Like POSSIP?
POSSIP.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Neat. That sounds like a great one to consider. And I know we're running short on time. Nicole will be popping back in a second to share a survey that PCSB would love to take, and I would love to see too, just to hear how you've received this webinar today and what other topics we should be covering. We have 2 more Talent Thursdays coming up, so want to hear from that. But my last question, I kind of mixed up a couple of things. I was also going to ask, like, as you think of not just having to get students ready virtually, how do you think about, like, particularly bringing in new teachers and integrating staff again? And again, I think Natalie brought up, like, how do you were likely going to have to do that virtually, at least at the beginning. What are some of the things you're thinking about right now about how you bring them in and create this culture where I feel like I'm hearing trust come out a lot, that they're trusting their leaders to have their best interests at heart, even if they are not giving their opinion directly on a particular topic that you're dealing with. Maybe it comes from how you're already maintaining trust with your team, but love to hear how you're thinking about continuing that as you move into the fall.
I think we'll we also, in addition to sort of student crew or, groups and communities, we have adult crew. And I think it'll be about thinking, how are we bringing smaller groups of adults together virtually to get to know one another, to celebrate one another, to be able to ask questions. I think one of the biggest losses, like in terms of recruitment, is not being able to come into the building, like be with our students, be with other teachers, because I think more than anything, that experience helps shape your entry into your relationship with the new school. So I think figuring out how we replicate some of that virtually.
Yeah, love that.
And I think
Natalie?
also, like, yeah, I was just saying, like, creating, I have said intentional a couple of times, but like, you do new teacher and experienced teacher mentoring during the school year. That's not something that should change, right? And then thinking about how you build relationships across teams. There are lots of virtual programs that will randomly assign you to a person in your organization to have a date with. And this is the kind of stuff that you should do more often, because you are not going to see each other in the hallways, right? And then lastly, earlier, we talked about like revising what PB looks like. And I really just cannot say this enough. There are lots of instructional things that people can do in webinars, right? Like they can take an hour on a Saturday and get through your lesson plan internalization unit or whatever it might be. You can do that in a webinar outside of your whole group learning. But there are other things that should happen together with the team and in small groups with the team that you should really plan. And you should prioritize that in-person time and make it super valuable and super intentional around learning about each other, so that you don't use that time that you all have together, which is going to be fleeting, on stuff that's not going to really maximize building your school culture.
Yeah, so real intentional time. Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. And Kenneth, any final word? You have like 1 minute to say any final statements.
No, I'm taking notes on what Natalie and Dahlia are saying. I'm like, oh my gosh, like light bulb, because I've been so thinking about the now. And I was interviewing someone and they're like, so what are the plans for new teacher orientation? I'm like, shoot, I've been thinking so much about what we're doing with our teachers now. So I'm like, I'm just starting to make that pivot. So yes, I'm a learner right now.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that, you know, we need to build some time for school leaders to have a chance to connect with others. Because as I think Natalie said before, we don't need to recreate the wheel. There's a lot of great ideas that are out there already. We just need to share them and feel them. We're good at doing that as educators, right? We know how to do that already. So thank you guys again for your time today. Really, really appreciate you stepping away during your lunchtime or whatever time. The time is amorphous right now. This is for you to spend time talking about this topic and helping us think about it. Feel free, there's a lot of great thoughts and ideas in the chat. So feel free to save the chat if you haven't already. And as I said, make sure you click on the link Nicole shared a minute ago to give us your feedback. And we'll be coming at you again next Thursday with another topic. We're going to be talking about adjusting staffing plans, how we're thinking about any things with that next week also. So thanks again to our panelists, Dahlia, Natalie, and Kenneth. And of course, Lydia too, for helping out with our Equitizer, as well as managing lots of questions that were coming through on the chat too. So have a great